My name's Brandon and this is Nickelodeon Video Game History, a show where I take a look back on all of the video games based on Nickelodeon shows and retrospectively review them. Timmy Turner might have been snubbed from Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl, but in our current place on the Nickelodeon Video Game History timeline, he's about to be spotlighted in a big way. We've already seen the pretty good Enter the Cleft on the GBA, but Nickelodeon's next two releases are both going to be flashy home console showings for Fairly OddParents. Released on November 3, 2003, Fairly OddParents Breakin Da Rules was the first home console game based on the show. It was also the final Nickelodeon game released in 2003. The honour of translating Timmy Turner into 3D was bestowed upon Blitz Games. Founded in 1990, Blitz Games was yet another developer that primarily made their mark on the gaming industry through licensed properties. Breakin Da Rules might have been their first Nick game, but it would be far from their last. They'd return for the sequel the following year titled Shadow Showdown for starters. Then after a few years away from Nick, they'd return in an even bigger way, developing Atlantis SquarePantis, Underpants Slam, Guardians of Gross, iCarly, and SpongeBob's Surf and Skate Road Trip. Unfortunately, like most developers who were built around licensed IP, they struggled once the industry turned away from these games as they became less and less profitable. Eventually, Blitz Games folded. We're well and truly in the era where Nick games came to every single platform they could, so naturally Breakin Da Rules had a GBA port too. Helix was at the helm of this one, a pleasant realisation for me because they developed the genuinely excellent GBA port of Tak and the Power of Juju. Seriously, it's probably one of my favourite GBA games ever made. They'll return later in this series for Tak 2, as well as the GBA port of Shadow Showdown, and the handheld exclusive Clash with the Anti-World. Critically, the home console version came out pretty strong on the Xbox and PlayStation 2. Reviews sat around a 7, which is respectable for a regular game, and a near miracle for a licensed game in the early 2000s. The average score does get dragged down by the GameCube though, which reviewed around a 6. Not entirely sure if Nintendo-focused reviewers were just harsher, or if the game ran poorly on the platform, but if we take the higher averages from PlayStation and Xbox, this is easily one of the best reviewed Nick games ever. There aren't any surviving reviews of the GBA version that I could find, but considering what Helix are capable of, I'm pretty confident in its quality. Timmy Turner's Wishfield adventures are perfect for video game adaptations. Let's see what Breakin Da Rules has in store for us. Fairly OddParents is all about the crazy shenanigans Timmy gets involved in by having fairies at his disposal that can grant damn near every wish. But how do you make this work on the GBA? Well, you strip Cosmo and Wanda of their powers, of course. The first thing you encounter in Breakin Da Rules is a cutscene where Cosmo and Wanda allow their copy of Da Rules to fall into the hands of anti-fairies. This leads to them being demoted and losing much of their power. It's a decent enough explanation to explain why Timmy isn't super OP in this game, or can just wish for any number of game-breaking things. All of this story setup leads to a pretty interesting game. The first OddParents game was an action platformer, but here Helix go for something completely different. Breakin Da Rules on GBA is basically a shmup. The general gist of the game is that you run from left to right and shoot down waves of enemies. There basically aren't any platforming elements here like one would expect initially. I guess the closest comparison I can make for the gameplay is something like Contra or Metal Slug. This is really unique. There have been examples of other Cartoon Network or Nick games digging into the shmup genre, but never quite like this. It's genuinely refreshing. Controls are simple as they usually are on the GBA. You have a gun that can be fired with B and you'll jump with A. As you run through the levels and destroy enemies, you'll see what are known as Cosmo coins. These act as a currency, allowing you to use two different types of special attacks. The first is a bomb that costs 3 coins to use. It's activated with R and it's pretty handy for certain types of enemies or when you're overwhelmed, although it can be clunky. The bomb doesn't go off if it makes contact with an enemy. Instead, it only explodes if it hits the ground, which makes for some real awkwardness. Similarly, you can press R once the bomb is in the air and it immediately explodes. I never truly felt comfortable using this attack, and I think that mostly comes down to the weird decision not to have it explode when it crosses paths with an enemy. Your other special attack is activated via L, and it's more closely linked to wishes. Depending on the level, you'll either temporarily control Cosmo or Wanda, who start shooting lasers from their wands and can't be hurt, or you'll activate a screen clearing satellite laser. These cost 10 and 15 coins respectively, which has clearly been priced to keep players from spamming it throughout levels. As you progress through the game, you'll start seeing various power-ups, stuff like increased firepower that's to be expected in a game like this. There was one weird power-up that was like an inflatable Timmy balloon, which I think was meant to act as a shield, but it was completely hit or miss when it came to stopping attacks. Even worse is that one of my least favourite design elements is present here: negative power-ups. I don't know who decided this was a cool idea, but I despise games that trick players into picking up power-ups only for them to enforce some sort of negative state on the player. In Breakin Da Rules, you'll have to dodge power-ups that invert your controls or render your weapon useless. It's just annoying and only teaches players to stay away from all pickups. Why would I pick anything up for like a 5-second increase in firepower when there's a strong chance I could pick up a negative ability and end up losing a life because of it? Combat is the heart of this game. There really isn't anything else going on outside of it. The gameplay you experience in the opening level never really changes. It does kind of borrow elements from the beat 'em up genre though. In those games, you'll generally run along and all of a sudden you'll be locked into an area where you can't progress until you defeat every enemy. Breakin Da Rules uses that system here, periodically trapping you to a single screen and having to defeat a wave of enemies. This is a kind of cool addition and really forces the player to engage with the combat. Outside of these little combat arenas, you can actually just run past enemies for the most part, and the confined space means you really have to get inventive with your movement to avoid taking hits. I also want to shout out the enemy variety here. Helix constantly shakes this up so that somehow they never get boring. Just as soon as you think you've nailed every enemy's movement pattern, they'll introduce a new tweak or completely brand new enemy to get you back on your toes. But the combat doesn't come without its flaws, the biggest of which comes down to the damage system. If you take a single hit, you die. This makes the game pretty damn hard at times. They kind of compensate for this by giving you a handy amount of lives to start, and every new level you enter resets your life counter, which is nice. But the rate at which you'll lose lives quickly nullifies this. 1-ups are kinda scarce too, so expect to be hitting the continue screen a lot. In an attempt to harken back to the arcade days, you have a set amount of continues. Every time you die and restart, you'll use one of these. You can actually earn more continues through an item pickup in levels, but again, you'll lose lives at a rate that far exceeds this. Possibly the game's saving grace in this department is that there's a difficulty select option. I played through on normal and really felt the heat, so maybe easy would be better for players who aren't looking for an intense challenge. And my final issue with the game's combat is the boss battles. Surprise, surprise. They aren't too badly designed at their core. If you've ever played a shmup boss battle before, they'll all be relatively familiar. What I really disliked was how long they are. Once you figure out the pattern, it's pretty easy, but it takes so many shots to bring each boss down that it just becomes tedious work. There's also the extra annoying fact that they randomly remove your wish powers for these boss battles. There's no explanation for this, which stands out like a sore thumb when they go through the effort of explaining the low power levels of Cosmo and Wanda at the beginning. And because of this, it actually means you're free to kinda just spam those attacks throughout levels. The special wish attacks may have a higher price, but you'll get enough coins to just constantly use these throughout the level when you don't have to save up for the finale boss battle. When it came to level design, I had a bit of a love-hate relationship. The theming of each level was great and constantly changing, which keeps you engaged. All of these different worlds are interesting, but the big issue is the pacing of a lot of them. Some levels are the perfect length, while others are overly long to the point of boredom. It's made doubly worse if you lose all your lives and have to trudge through it all again. Some checkpointing would ease this pain, but still not fully address the core issues here. The gameplay never changes from start to finish, so the game desperately relies on new locales and enemies to stop you from getting tired of the whole thing. Ultimately, Breakin Da Rules on GBA can end up being more frustrating than fun. It's a simple and cool idea to do this kind of game with a Nick IP, but the unforgiving nature of its one-hit kill combat can be overbearing. It's also hard not to compare it to Tak and the Power of Juju, which felt much flashier. I'm sure that title had a way bigger budget, And Breakin Da Rules isn't a slouch in the visuals or anything, but it's hard not to make the comparison when they were released so closely. It feels like this game is the equivalent of a novel or screenplay's first draft. All the base ideas are there and interesting, but it's in desperate need of someone to give it some TLC and swoop in to smooth out the edges. You could probably chalk that down to a rushed or less supported development. This game came out less than a month after TAC to put it all in perspective. Overall, Breakin Da Rules is worth checking out, but I don't think I'd recommend it over Enter the Cleft. Hopefully the home console version can step it up a notch.
Timmy, we're leaving for our seminar weekend.
Duty calls! We certainly won't be having any fun this weekend.
Breakin Da Rules on home consoles follows a pretty similar narrative to the GBA release, but it's tweaked a bit. Cosmo and Wanda still lose their copy of Da Rules and face punishment, but instead of the anti-fairies nabbing it, Vicky accidentally ends up with it without fully realising. This results in Cosmo and Wanda becoming mostly powerless, and also sets up the structure for the game's levels, because Vicky starts inserting Timmy into weird wish scenarios without realising. The setup is actually pretty cool, but seeing them explain away the fairy powers got me thinking. I would have really loved to see a Fairly OddParents game in the style of Scribblenauts. Give me a game with a bunch of puzzles and challenges with open-ended solutions that can be conquered via wishing for various stuff. I think you could have a genuinely great game with that, particularly because it's basically just Scribblenauts. So once that introduction happens, you're dropped into Timmy's house, which acts as a hub world. You have a selection of levels to head to at first, with more opening up as you complete the levels. Each level almost plays out like a singular episode of the show. Timmy will be interacting with something, Vicky will come in screaming, make a crazy wish by accident, and Timmy has to try and get things back to normal. There might not be an overarching narrative, but it does create for some wildly creative and unique levels that give Timmy massively different abilities. The overall product ends up being a hodgepodge of gameplay. If you've followed my channel for long enough, you probably know I'm not usually a fan of this. Bizarrely, I think it kind of works well here. The most important thing is that it doesn't go the Jet Fusion Syndrome route, where the game is one specific style for half the game, then suddenly throws it all out the window. When Timmy gets sucked into a video game, he takes on a Mega Man style buster. The level with Timmy at camp is all about stealth, the level inside a Crimson Chin comic sees Timmy take up the Cleft mantle, and he cycles through different superpowers. Structuring Breakin Da Rules like this makes the game constantly feel fresh and gives it a unique identity, but it has pitfalls. Gigantic, gaping pitfalls. The bathtub level has Timmy jumping into a mech suit that controls awfully, and then you have the jetpack section of the alien invasion level that is all sorts of awkward. It's just a natural danger of doing something like this. If you're focused predominantly on one style of gameplay, take Battle for Bikini Bottom's 3D platforming for example, you can really fine-tune and craft it. With a brand new, or at least pretty heavily altered style of gameplay popping up in every level, it's much harder to make the whole thing feel polished. While the gameplay jumps around from level to level, they do keep the same basic structure of how they unfold. The goal of each level is to get the pages of Da Rules back. To do this, Timmy needs to find 5 wish stars and then head to a marked spot. This retrieves the page and also grants Cosmo and Wanda the power to grant a wish.
Can we pretend that airplanes in the night sky like shooting stars? I could really use a wish right now, wish right now, wish right now.
Every level has at least a couple of wishes in them, with the later ones featuring 3. These always give Timmy some extra ability to either deal with enemies, solve puzzles, traverse the level, or a combination of all 3. When Timmy is just in his regular state, he controls pretty well. His abilities are at their most basic in this form, he can jump and run and that's about it, but it does work well. I think my only control issue stemmed from running into walls or objects. If you run full speed into anything, Timmy does this super annoying animation where he brutally slams into it and then gets knocked the hell out. It's a super weird addition, especially because I mostly only saw it when trying to access the game's save points, which come in the form of a door for some reason. Outside of the main goal, the game does tempt you with the collectible Crimson Chin cards scattered around levels. Something like this is par for the course in a 3D platformer type game, particularly in this era. The collectibles are usually a little tougher to find though. I found practically everyone in the game without much effort. In this day and age, the reward is pretty lame, you get clips from the show, but back in 2003 when YouTube didn't exist and streaming services were unheard of, this would have been really cool. Apparently the PS2 version exclusively had an entire episode you could unlock as well, which would no doubt add to the allure of grabbing every card. As far as I'm aware, there was only one specific Fairly OddParents home video release at this point in time, so this was a big deal. The ease in which I collected the Crimson Chin cards does speak to a wider issue with Breakin Da Rules. This game is brain dead easy. It won't ever challenge you, at all. Even the most kid-friendly of cartoon games seems to always have one random difficulty spike. Without fail, a section will spring up and blindside you by being insanely tough. That never really happened here. The game really is so easy that you can pretty much switch your brain off most of the time and go through on autopilot. Sure, there were sections that were tedious and a chore to go through, but never anything I'd consider hard. I'm reviewing this as a 25-year-old man though, so for all I know this could be in the difficulty sweet spot for the target audience back in 2003. If you're playing this as a seasoned gamer though, you might be left unsatisfied. What will leave every player unsatisfied is the environments. Geez, these are so barren. Every level you come to is just empty and lifeless. For something like the stealth level where it's set at night and you're sneaking around, this has the right vibe. But when you're going around some more grandiose levels, it feels a little off. It's going to be hard not to compare everything to Battle for Bikini Bottom from now on, but that game's levels always have something going on. Tak and the Power of Juju had that too. In contrast, Breakin Da Rules has an enemy or two sprinkled in every now and then, but outside of that, it's just eerily quiet. That's not to say I hate everything about this game's presentation. It's a mixed bag, but overall I was impressed with how they brought the show to life. Firstly, I think they adapted Fairly OddParents' unique art style into 3D brilliantly. Breakin Da Rules looks incredibly unique and definitely stands out amongst the sea of similar games releasing during this era of gaming, and all of that comes down to the way they took the art style of the show and tried as hard as possible to stay faithful. It just has such charm and visual appeal, at least to me, which is probably why the environments being so empty let me down so much. They look great, but being lifeless makes them a bit of a waste. But like just about every positive aspect in Breakin Da Rules, the presentation comes with caveats. Cutscene animations are pretty janky. You can tell that the animation and movement side of things wasn't as polished. And you get unintentionally hilarious moments like Spatula Woman's eyes spazzing out. Cutscene audio is also ridiculously low quality. All of the iconic voices are here and the game has so much dialogue, but in cutscenes they all sound awful.
Well, we won! Well done, Timmy! You did great!
Yeah, and we found more pages of the rules. I feel more magical already.
Every line sounds ridiculously compressed, like the kind of audio you'd hear from an old Flash game. Part of me thinks this was a space-saving measure. The game has an unbelievable amount of dialogue, so maybe that's why they did this? I don't know, it's strange. The voice acting for periphery characters can be really bad too. It sounds like their lines were a massive afterthought.
Oh, I heard something, Timmy. I heard one of the cream puffs talking. Something about badges. Oh, and a name. Vicky.
Weirdly, I have a criticism that I never thought I'd say during the course of Nickelodeon video game history. There are just far too many cutscenes. You get cutscenes constantly, not just before and after a level, but frequently during the level too. And these aren't tiny little breaks either, some of these stretch on forever. The gameplay is always being interrupted by a story moment. This was pretty cool at first because I don't know if I've ever seen this level of dedication to story in a home console Nick game to this point, but a few levels in it started to wear off. The breaking point for me was the cutscene prior to the level where Timmy becomes a dog. It was like Hideo freaking Kojima himself directed this section. This cutscene would put Death Stranding or any of the Metal Gear Solid games to shame. I think the biggest reason I disliked the frequency of cutscenes ultimately came down to them being not very interesting or funny. Although I can't tell if this is just because the writing was substandard, or if it's because I was never a big Fairly OddParents fan in the first place. Maybe a diehard fan would love this. I find it hard to believe anybody would enjoy this abomination though.
It's Grease! Grease!
Yeah, Grease. Grease is the word. It's got groove and it's got meaning.
Grease is the time! It's the place! It's the motion!
Okay, I'm leaving now.
Overall, I think Blitz Games did a pretty good job capturing the spirit of Fairly OddParents, but the production could use a fair bit of polish. It's certainly rough around the edges. The good news is Nickelodeon had enough faith in them to bring them back the following year for Shadow Showdown, so hopefully that game can iron out the wrinkles here. There's a lot of potential.
Where are you going, Timmy?
We're going camping with the Squirrely Scouts.
Breakin Da Rules on home consoles ends up committing the biggest sin in gaming. It's just kinda boring. It's competent in most areas, and the aspects that are bad aren't over the top egregiously bad. It's not the kind of stuff to send you into major bouts of frustration. But the game really isn't that much fun to play, and I think that comes down to the non-existent difficulty and the barren levels. It's just dull and boring. The game is only 4 hours long, but it feels triple that length because of the aspects I mentioned. There's no challenge, nothing too interesting, just boredom. A great representation of this is the final boss battle. You take on Vicky, who has been transformed into a dragon. Instead of heroically vanquishing her, you have to make her hit buttons that spell out the sentence, "I wish I never took the book from Timmy." Such a fitting way to end this game, honestly. It's probably worth giving Breakin Da Rules a spin, especially if you're a big Fairly OddParents fan. Just don't expect a mind-blowing experience. Also, Timmy joins Mario in the No Nips Club. Next time, we'll be taking a look at Fairly OddParents Shadow Showdown. Yep, the very next Nickelodeon game released was the follow-up to this game. Playing these games back to back will be very interesting and puts a lot of pressure on Shadow Showdown. Can Blitz Games polish up these problem areas in under a year? Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out.